You're looking at the White House burning. The soldiers setting the fires, they're British. For the first 100 years of its existence, America's greatest enemy wasn't some distant empire. It was the nation it broke away from, Britain. They fought 2 wars and came to the brink of a 3rd and a 4th more times than anyone remembers. So how did we get from this to this? From bitter rivals who burned each other's capitals to inseparable allies who share their deepest intelligence? The answer isn't a single handshake. It's a century-long Cold War most people have never heard of, filled with bluffs, ultimatums, and a slow, grudging realization that they needed each other far more than they hated each other.
The War of 1812 ended in a stalemate. The treaty signed in Ghent solved almost nothing. It was more of a ceasefire than a peace. Britain still saw America as an upstart, a failed experiment that might one day be brought back into the fold. America saw Britain as an arrogant monarchy, a constant threat looming from the north in Canada. The world's longest undefended border was, for decades, one of the most heavily militarized and disputed frontiers on the planet. Both sides expected another war. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And for the next 50 years, every diplomatic incident, every border dispute was a spark that threatened to ignite the entire continent.
In 1823, President Monroe issued his famous doctrine: the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization. It was a bold, assertive statement of American power. It was also a complete and utter bluff. The United States in the 1820s had a tiny navy. It couldn't enforce a blockade of its own coastline, let alone protect all of North and South America. So why did the European powers listen? They didn't. They listened to the one power that actually controlled the seas: Great Britain. The British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, had his own reasons for keeping other Europeans out of the Americas. He wanted to trade with the newly independent Latin American republics, so the Royal Navy, not the U.S. Navy, became the unspoken enforcer of the Monroe Doctrine. America was writing checks its military couldn't cash, and Britain was quietly covering the bill for its own strategic and economic reasons. The border with Canada was a constant source of friction. In 1837, a rebellion broke out in Upper Canada. American sympathizers used a steamship called the Caroline to ferry supplies to the rebels. In response, Canadian loyalists under British command crossed the Niagara River at night, seized the ship, killed an American crewman, and sent the Caroline, now on fire, over Niagara Falls. The American public was outraged. Cries for war echoed through Congress. It was a direct violation of American sovereignty. The British, however, refused to apologize, claiming it was an act of self-defense. War was only averted through delicate back-channel diplomacy, but the incident left a deep scar. It proved just how easily a minor border skirmish could escalate into a full-blown international crisis. Then came the Oregon dispute. For years, the U.S. and Britain had jointly occupied the vast Oregon country. But by the 1840s, American settlers were pouring in along the Oregon Trail. The 1844 presidential campaign of James K. Polk ran on an aggressive expansionist platform with the slogan 54-40 or fight. It was a demand for the entire territory, up to the southern border of Russian Alaska. This was a direct threat of war. For a while, it looked like it might happen, but Polk was a pragmatist. His real target was Mexico. He couldn't afford a war on 2 fronts. Britain, too, had little appetite for another costly war in North America over remote territory. In the end, they compromised, splitting the territory at the 49th parallel,
where the border remains today. They had stared into the abyss, and both had blinked. Nothing tested the relationship like the American Civil War. From London, the conflict looked very different. The British aristocracy felt a certain kinship with the landed gentry of the South. More importantly, their massive textile industry, the engine of the British economy, was utterly dependent on Southern cotton. They called it King Cotton diplomacy. The Confederacy was convinced that Britain's economic needs would force them to recognize its independence and break the Union's naval blockade. For the first 2 years of the war, they were nearly right. British public opinion was divided, and the government in London seriously debated intervention. For Abraham Lincoln, this was the ultimate nightmare. A war against the South on land, and a war against the full might of the Royal Navy at sea.
And in November 1861, that nightmare almost became reality. A U.S. warship, the San Jacinto, intercepted a British mail ship, the Trent, in international waters. On board were 2 Confederate diplomats on their way to London and Paris to plead for recognition. The American captain, Charles Wilkes, acted without orders. He boarded the British vessel and arrested the diplomats, taking them back to Boston as prisoners. In the North, Wilkes was celebrated as a hero. In Britain, it was seen as an act of war, a profound insult to the British flag and a violation of maritime law. The public was incensed. The London Times roared, "The United States government is in the position of an outlaw, a menace to the civilized world." The British government didn't hesitate. They issued an ultimatum to the Lincoln administration: release the prisoners and issue a formal apology, or face war. This was not a bluff. 11,000 elite British troops were dispatched to Canada. The Royal Navy was put on war footing, preparing to shatter the Union blockade and bombard American cities. The British ambassador in Washington was instructed to close the embassy and return home if the demands were not met within 7 days. Lincoln was trapped. If he backed down, he would look weak to his own people. If he didn't, he would trigger a war with the world's greatest superpower, a war that would almost certainly guarantee Confederate independence. The fate of the United States hung by a thread. The original draft of the British ultimatum was harsh and inflammatory, but in one of his final acts before his death from typhoid fever, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, reviewed the dispatch. He felt its tone made it impossible for the Americans to accept without humiliation. He painstakingly redrafted key passages, softening the language and inserting a crucial loophole. He added a clause that allowed the United States to claim that Captain Wilkes had acted without authorization. This gave Lincoln a way out. It allowed the U.S. to release the prisoners, not because Britain demanded it, but because they were correcting the mistake of their own officer. It was a masterpiece of diplomacy, a face-saving exit ramp from a highway to war. War was averted, but the anger remained. Throughout the Civil War, Confederate agents used British shipyards to build a fleet of fast, powerful commerce raiders. The most famous was the CSS Alabama. These ships, built in Britain, armed elsewhere and crewed by British sailors, went on to destroy or capture over 250 Union merchant vessels. They crippled the American merchant marine for a generation. The United States government was furious. They argued that Britain had violated its neutrality by allowing these warships to be built. After the war, this became the single biggest point of contention between the two nations, known as the Alabama Claims. America demanded massive financial compensation for the damages. Many in Congress, led by the powerful Senator Charles Sumner, even suggested Britain should just hand over Canada as payment. For years, the dispute festered, poisoning relations. But by 1871, both sides had reasons to settle. The US was focused on westward expansion and industrial growth. Britain was increasingly wary of the rising power of a newly unified Germany in Europe. They needed stability. The result was the Treaty of Washington, a landmark moment. An international tribunal was convened in Geneva to arbitrate the claims. In the end, the tribunal ordered Great Britain to pay the United States $15.5 million in damages. It was a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to billions today. But Britain paid it. It was a tacit admission of guilt, and more importantly, a signal that London now valued a stable relationship with Washington more than its pride. It was the first time a major global power had submitted to international arbitration like this. An apology paid in gold.
The settlement of the Alabama claims marked a turning point. Historians call the period from about 1872 to the turn of the century the Great Rapprochement. The overt hostility began to fade, replaced by a grudging respect and a growing recognition of shared values. They shared a language, a common law tradition, and increasingly a web of economic and cultural ties. British authors were widely read in America, and American industrialists began to challenge British dominance. The old dynamic of former colony and former master was slowly, almost imperceptibly, evolving into a relationship of equals. But there would be one last major test, one final standoff, before the old rivalry was truly put to rest.
In 1895, a long-simmering border dispute between Venezuela and the colony of British Guiana flared up. When gold was discovered in the disputed region, things got serious. Venezuela appealed to the United States for help, citing the Monroe Doctrine. The administration of Grover Cleveland, led by the aggressive Secretary of State Richard Olney, saw an opportunity. Olney sent a blistering note to London, essentially declaring that the United States was now sovereign on the American continent, and its word was law. He demanded that Britain submit the border dispute to arbitration. The British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, was dismissive. He essentially replied that the Monroe Doctrine had no standing in international law, and this was none of America's business. For a few tense months, war seemed possible for the last time.
But this wasn't 1823 or 1861. The United States of 1895 was an industrial giant, soon to be the largest economy in the world. It now had a powerful modern navy to back up its words. More importantly, the world had changed. Britain was no longer the lone, unchallenged superpower. In Europe, a unified Germany was building a massive army, and most alarmingly for Britain, a world-class navy. Kaiser Wilhelm II was making no secret of his desire to challenge British global supremacy. London looked at the situation and made a calculated strategic choice. A war with the United States over a patch of jungle in South America was a costly distraction they could not afford. Facing a new, more dangerous rival in their own backyard, they needed friends, not more enemies.
Britain backed down. They agreed to arbitration, and the crisis passed. But the implications were enormous. Britain had tacitly accepted American supremacy in the Western Hemisphere. They began to withdraw their naval forces from the Caribbean, effectively handing over policing duties to the U.S. Navy. This was the true beginning of the special relationship. It wasn't born out of a sudden burst of affection. It was a pragmatic, cold-blooded calculation. Britain needed to focus on Germany. America was a rising power that was better to have as a friend than a foe. They decided their interests were more aligned than they were opposed. The 100-year Cold War was finally over. When World War I erupted in 1914, this new alignment was put to the ultimate test. While the U.S. remained neutral for 3 years, its economic and industrial might heavily favored the Allied cause. When America finally entered the war in 1917, its soldiers fought and died alongside the British in the trenches of France. The two navies worked hand in hand to defeat the U-boat menace. The old rivalry, the memory of burning capitals and near-miss wars, was washed away in a sea of shared blood and common purpose. The great rapprochement was complete. The special relationship was forged in the fires of a global conflict.
So when did America and Britain stop hating each other? There's no single date. It wasn't a sudden change of heart. It was a slow, 100-year process of letting go. It was the realization that their shared language, laws, and economic systems were more powerful than their old grievances. It was driven by the necessity of facing new threats, first from Imperial Germany and later from the Soviet Union. The special relationship wasn't planned, it evolved out of a series of crises that forced two old rivals to discover they had become friends. An alliance born not of sentiment, but of strategy, that would go on to shape the course of the modern world.